We are, I think we are live, and I'm double checking here. Yes, absolutely. We are. There we go. We are live with Professor Donna Murch. Let me make sure we are all set. Yes, we are. Here we go. Excellent. Um, good evening, Professor Donna Murch.
Thank you. So good to see you, Bassam.
It is so wonderful to see you, and I know that we've connected before. I'm very excited. I've been trying to get a hold of you for some time. This is basically a talk or a conversation or an interview on race matters before and after the elections, because it's not just about after the elections, even though this is really important, and it's not just about before the elections. It's actually race matters, period. But I wanted to emphasize the elections because a lot of people seem to assume that the past 4 years have been the issue with race, and I reject that. The issue has been an issue, and more than an issue, for much longer than the past 4 years under President Trump, and it's likely to continue. So this is why I'd love to us to get some insights from you, and I will introduce you before we move forward. This is part of the 2020 election and whatnot series, and we've had about five discussions before, and we're very happy to have you. So to everyone joining us, we are on Facebook as well as Twitter, not Twitter, sorry. We're on Facebook as well as YouTube, which I'm very excited about because not often have we done that. And now we have the ability to stream to different locations. Uh, I'm very excited to be joined by Donna Murch, an associate professor of history at Rutgers University. She is currently completing a new trade press book entitled Crack in Los Angeles: Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. She also has a forthcoming book of essays that will be published later this year entitled Asata Taught Me: State Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Movement for Black Lives. In October 2010, Murch published the award winning monograph Living for the City: Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, with the University of North Carolina Press, which won the Phyllis Wheatley Prize in December 2011. She has written for the Sunday Washington Post, New Republic, Nation, Boston Review, the Chronicle for Higher Education, Black Scholar, and the Journal of American History, as well as appearing in Stanley Nelson's documentary Black Panthers: Vanguard of the Revolution. And there's a lot more. We will try to have as much information on Donna's scholarship and activities on the feed, either today live or when we publish the interview posthumously. So, first, welcome, Donna. Thank you for joining us. I am very excited again to speak with you about the election and the question of race before and after. So I'll start with very basic question. How do you interpret the outcomes of the 2020 presidential elections?
Okay, let me just say I am an avid reader of Jedediah, and I followed your career and your projects, and it's just an honor to be here, as well as having always watching your incredible DJ sets, which bring much needed joy in this
Thank
very
you.
difficult time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Um, oh my goodness, the racial politics of the election. We're in a very hard time. I Many people I know. I think we spent our initial uh, the Tuesday and Wednesday of the election in an utter state of shock, paralysis, and fear because of how much closer the election was than had been predicted. And I think we all have PTSD from 2016. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, so I
Hmm.
grew up in Erie. So this
So
was
you had
particular.
something to do with it
Yes,
in
our
both times.
exactly. And I now live in Pennsylvania. I now live in Eastern Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is really the other side of the world, but still Pennsylvania. Um, and so I just literally had PTSD. And there was this moment because in 2016 I stayed up until 2:30, and I remembered hearing that when the results for Pennsylvania came in. And I was a black child that grew up in Western Pennsylvania in the 70s. And so the kind of violent racial politics that Trump represents was very much a part of my childhood. So I often talk
Mhm.
about Pennsylvania as being Trump before Trump. And that speaks to this larger question about the racial politics of this election. The first thing I want to say is that it's very frustrating to see the way in which the Democratic Party and the mainstream media treats Trump as if he is this horrible aberration, which is unlike anything we've ever seen. And I think that Trump is the logical culmination of a lot of the politics of the Republican Party post civil rights movement, and also, unfortunately, the larger two party system. I see a direct line from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. And, recently in the discussions of the election, just as Ronald Reagan gave a speech to launch his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the bodies of three civil rights workers were found, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, so did Donald Trump give a speech in Sanford, Florida, where, of course, Trayvon Martin was killed. So I think that in terms of the racial politics of the election, one of the most important things is how close the election was again in the swing states. So we have 70 million people that are supporting these violently racist white power politics. And I think that while I am relieved, I, of course, supported Biden um, as really an anti Trump vote. But this was a very difficult election because the combination of Joe Biden and also Kamala Harris, who is so important, this important precedent of having our first female vice president and our first Black female vice president, our first Indian American president. This is very, very important. So the kinds of limitations on who can serve at the top of the United States has been broken in terms of the vice presidency. So that's very important. But that said, both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they are people that are deeply implicated in the politics of mass incarceration. And so I think that we were given a very difficult choice. You know, the frightening, genocidal, racial, white power politics of Trump, but a still relatively conservative, someone I would describe as being the right wing of the Democratic Party. And this has happened after we've seen the largest protest movement in history over the past 5 months and a fight to protest state violence and to argue about the importance of Black lives. So I'm quite relieved that Donald Trump did not win, but I am also deeply concerned about what the Biden presidency is going to look like and the scale of support for Donald Trump and the kinds of right wing politics that he represents. So I just see this as a very hard time. I'm an American historian, so I'm sanguine about the continuities of racial violence and white supremacy in American past and present. Nevertheless, this is just one of the most frightening moments that I personally have witnessed, and almost everyone I know feels the same way.
I was on mute. Thank you, Donna. I want to follow up with actually many questions, and one of the questions that are on people's minds, having seen some of the data, some of the images and reports lately regarding the increased support for Trump among uh, black, brown, and Asian populations. And that is a signal that potentially a signal that his coalition is growing. but is it also something else? Can you tell us a little bit about how to interpret this, and whether it's all bad, and how can we view this development, or is it accurate empirically?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that one of the things I was really struck by is once it became clear that Biden was going to win the Electoral College, and of course, the popular vote by over 5 million people, then there was a turn to trying to figure out um, the distribution of the vote and why the election looked the way it did. And the day after, there was a lot of discussion about the increase, drawing on the Edison polls of the increase of Black and Latino support. Most of the mainstream media coverage focused on that, although there was also an increase in the vote by Asian Americans. So a lot of people drew these conclusions, these enormous conclusions from it, arguing that this showed that Trump was a multicultural uh, phenomena and that he had broadened his coalition. And in some ways, we were seeing a transcendence of the politics of race just because there was a relatively small percentage in the increase of Blacks and Latinos supporting Donald Trump. Um, in this, I followed the journalism very carefully of Juan Gonzalez. And I think the original reporting that he's done about the Edison polls is extremely important. And one of his biggest arguments is that elections are won not by percentages, but by total numbers. So, one of the striking things is that Trump maintained his vote and exceeded it from 2016. But the reason that we've had the success of the Biden Harris ticket is because large numbers of people turned out. And of course, the Latino turnout has been absolutely crucial. I mean, there was one of the things I was a bit troubled by in the coverage was when they were talking about the flipping of Georgia and Arizona from red to blue. I felt that there was not enough discussion of the demographics of how this has happened. It was talked about only really in relationship to Biden and not in relationship to the shifting demographics, the enormous black, the enormous brown and native turnout in Arizona that made this small electoral college miracle possible. And of course, the organizing efforts of Stacey Abrams and other Black grassroots activists on the ground in Georgia. So I think it's very important to talk about the size and the importance of Black and Brown turnout, and that in many ways, this is what delivered the uh, the Electoral College for Biden. Um, I think another important point to make about this is that how do we understand the relationship between Biden winning the Electoral College and then the real failures, I would say, of the Democrats in the down ballot races? Political commentators have talked about how, in many ways, and I draw this also from Mike Davis, who gave a brilliant interview about this, that in many ways, the Biden campaign modeled itself on the Clinton campaign. It didn't make the mistake of not going to Wisconsin, but it focused largely on white swing, middle class swing voters, suburban voters in the swing states. And I think that while Biden won, not with the enormous lead that was predicted, this also helps to explain why we have a Biden Harris ticket at the top, but then we've seen the losses for the Democrats down in the down ballot races. So one of the things that I find frustrating is that increasingly we see such a racialized two-party system. This is, of course, not new. This is the product of African American incorporation really into the political system. So it's not until 1965 where you had, at shortest a decade and at longest at least 30 years of direct organizing, the fight to have African Americans to their demand to have full political rights. This is not one until 1965. That's very important, that essentially the Black population in the United States has not had full political rights until the last 55 years. Of course, when African Americans win full voting rights, we see a transformation of the two-party system in which the Democratic Party, that had been the party of white supremacy, becomes the party of racial liberalism. And by 1968 is when you generally talk about 3 years after the passage of the Voting Rights as full incorporation. Well, this resulted in the realignment of large numbers of whites into the Republican Party. So, after the election of Lyndon Johnson, no president has been elected with the majority of the white vote. So, this is another way in which Trump is about the direct continuity from this earlier period. I'd say that right now, this racialization of the two-party system, it just has accelerated. Trump is winning with very large margins of the white population. And the kind of discussions that happened after we had the election results focused on the idea that the Trump vote by white men had gone down 2% and had increased by blacks and Latinos, a percentage between 3 and 5%. And I thought this was a real problem because it hides the true demographics of what the election looks like. Trump's largest base of support is, of course, evangelical Christians that are 15% of the population, but 28% of the election. So it's almost like it's the elephant in the room that it is, of course, the white population cross class that is bringing us Donald Trump. But the focus on a small percentage of Latinos, especially in South Texas, as the explanation for Trump's strength, I think is just deeply problematic. The numbers and the scale of turnout among Blacks and Latinos were actually key to Biden's victory. At the same time, the tendency of the mainstream Democratic Party to only focus on a tiny segment of the electorate, this has to stop. If the Democratic Party is going to be a truly viable party in the future, it has to give up this strategy of really only seeing white voters as important. He did not even visit Texas. And I think that Texas, it's being explained for cultural reasons like abortion. But of course, the borderlands in Texas have been major sites of all kinds of radical organizing. The Democratic Party needs to focus on who its true constituencies are and expend the resources that should accord that, not only privileging a tiny portion of the white electorate.
Thank you, Donna. Um, uh, can you elaborate? I mean, there are a ton of questions that I'd love to ask you. Issue is that the shorter these interviews are, the more they circulate. So we have this catch 22. However, I will ask you more questions before we move on to. Towards the end, I'd like to have a more of a casual conversation, even more casual than this, about just ordinary people and ordinary discourse and uh, uh, how things are developing in various communities that are concerned, and I don't think the concern has ended, as you stated. But first, before we get to those issues, can you tell us a bit more deliberately and specifically, uh, what might the Biden presidency look like with respect to all these issues, as well as uh, how does it fit the larger trajectory in the larger trajectory of the two party politics. And uh, I keep asking this question of all of the people I've interviewed and discussed this with on this series. uh, are we stuck with the two parties? And is there any real liberation, not in the substantive sense, but in the institutional sense, without this two party system sort of cracking and giving, you know, space to other opportunities and movements, parties, something that actually breaks the dichotomy, the back and forth, the duality, the binary that we have now.
Yeah, I'll start with the last part first. This is a great source of sadness and consternation for me and many people that I know, because I think that it's never been as clear as it is now, the limitations of the kind of structure of democracy that we have in the United States. Its original basis in the Federalist Papers, and given our history of settler colonialism and slavery, of really a kind of constitution and structure of government, which was explicitly constructed in order to prevent majority rule. This is why we have the Electoral College. And the idea that the dominant part of our parliament is represented by region and not by population. And this has had such extraordinary problems. And it's very important to note that this is, of course, rooted in a history in which slaveholders were terrified about the potential of the non-slaveholding regions of the United States to outlaw slavery. So it's not just an abstract fear of tyranny of the majority, it's specifically a fear to protect racial slavery and extraction. And it just can't be said enough. I feel I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's just unclear to me how we can move forward in any constructive way without a rules change. All of these things, be it the Electoral College, winner take all elections, the inordinate power of the Senate, and of course, what's really frightening, I think, is that the Republican Party at the state and federal level has amassed so much power, not only its majority on the Supreme Court, but also the ways in which it has built will have control over the drawing of voter districts. So when you think about some of the defeats of Democrats in the down ballot elections, a lot of this has to do with the construction of voting districts at the state and federal level. So there's a real problem in which it's very clear, it's going all the way back to 2000. Every Democratic candidate has won the majority of the popular vote. The Republican Party has become a true minority power, but at the same time of it becoming a smaller and smaller minority of the population, it's strengthened its institutional power. And of course, I hate to even use this word, the masterful planning of Mitch McConnell, everything from how the courts have been packed all the way up through the Supreme Court to just, in many ways, I think the comparison of Mitch McConnell would be with Lyndon Johnson as the master of the Senate. So we're facing this problem of the institutionalization of a minority power and a minority constituency in the context of this multiracial democracy, and in which we're seeing a shift in the demographics, so that the white minority is essentially fighting to control the country and is doing so very, very successfully. And that needs to be said. In the mainstream media, this discussion of we can't determine whether or not Trump is a racist or the people who are voting for him or not are racist. I don't exactly know what would constitute a racist, given the very explicit references of things that he has said about Muslims, whole parts of the world, and attributing criminalizing entire populations. So if that's not racism, I actually don't know what racism is. So yeah, I think it's we need to fight over rules changes.
Did you want to say anything more about the next 4 years, or should we?
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry. I got stuck on the last part because I feel very passionately about that. I also am not quite sure in the immediate future how we will do this. But I do think there has to be a fight about the non-democratic structures and really the archaic nature of our own Constitution. I never thought that this would be possible, but if there's one slight bit of silver lining about the Trump administration is that I think that he has opened the door because of the way in which he has delegitimized institutions, that it's possible to have an open discussion about packing the court in ways that were unimaginable 4 years ago. Now, in terms of the Biden administration, I'm very concerned that the Biden administration and his recent announcements of his cabinet picks are going to be a replaying of the problems with both the Clinton and the Obama administration. We're seeing a lot of reaching out essentially to, or the contemporary equivalent of the liberal Republicans of the early 1960s. That, again, the strategy of who they were pitching the votes for, or trying to think about how to capture this very small sector of white suburban vote. And so thinking about a bipartisan cabinet, we saw, of course, the attacks on the left immediately after the election results came out. 40% of the House are part of the Progressive Caucus. So that's really important. When we talk about the left wing of the Democratic Party and the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party, they are large sections of congressmen. And yet they were actually blaming this portion of the party for their electoral failures. And I think it might be Mike Davis that pointed out that in some of the same states that Trump won, oh no, it was actually Annalise Orlick, that you also had successful referendums on minimum wage campaigns. So that tells you something, that there's a real tension in the country and that there's a need for a Democratic Party that's going to embrace a real program of economic redistribution. We are having such enormous amounts of hunger in the United States, of downward mobility. I saw a recent survey that said 41% of the population, of the African American population in one survey, said that they were food insecure. We're going to see an absolute tsunami of evictions. And so, my biggest fear about the Biden administration is that it's most concerned about capturing a very small percentage of the electorate and sees bipartisanship as the road to doing this. When it is just very clear, looking at the both Obama administrations of the, and this is even worse after the Trump period, the difficulty of getting Republicans to work with them. I mean, nearly all of the Republican Party and Republican politicians are not even certifying that Joe Biden has won the election. That should tell us that bipartisanship is not going to work.
Absolutely.
Not a happy,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just meant to say, not a happy story.
No, no. I mean, very little about any of this is happy. The only happy thing is that people are not shackled, and the struggle can go on to establish the sort of social justice that is a minimum, right? I mean, we talk about social justice as if it's a victory, and it is, but it has become a victory in a context where so much uh, is problematic, when so much is actually beyond the pale in terms of how behind we are on this question here in the United States. Um, okay,
Could I add one short thing to that that I
sure,
meant to also
sure.
mention, which is
This is this is yours. This is your floor.
oh, thank you. Well, something like a specific and concrete example is that so you had this attack on the left, which was just absolutely awful and also destructive even to the Democratic Party's own fortunes. But as we know, Joe Biden ran a relatively anemic campaign. There was not a lot of door knocking and grassroots organizing. And of course, the victories in Minnesota and Michigan were absolutely crucial. Rashida Tlaib played an essential role in getting out the vote and doing door knocking campaign. And similarly, Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. So we have this kind of the Democratic Party digesting of its own left wing and attacking it when they were so crucial in terms of their own states in getting out the vote. So I think that it's as if this memory, I often trace things back to 1984 to Reagan's sweeping victory of 49 states, every state but Walter Mondale's state of Minnesota. And I think the kind of logic of that the only way that the Democratic Party can win is to model itself on the Republican Party. This kind of vision of politics just weighs on the kinds of centrist Democrats who run the Democratic Party so that they're just replaying this story over and over and over, even though it's not a winning strategy.
Sorry, I was mute. I tried to put on mute because I was told that my breathing goes through the audio. All right. Yes, there is a lot to talk about here in terms of the politics that we see regarding the left. Also, in terms of the two forces that are pulling the Biden presidency in different directions. There's the fourth force that's saying, now that you've won, we need to actually execute the policies and the ideas that you won based on, and the ones for which we supported you, which is basically moving Biden in a more progressive direction. I'm not going to use the word left because I sometimes don't know what left is in America, because the Democratic Party is supposed to be left, and it's kind of like not really left, globally speaking. It's kind of left of center, maybe, on some issues. But then the other force is basically pulling Biden in the other direction towards the center, and sometimes center right, and that force is the force that has the logic, or that carries the logic of trying to stay in power and reproduce one's power in the United States. You've got to sort of be around the center, and you've got to satisfy the forces that are not just propping up the Republican Party, but they're also propping up the Democratic Party. As we know, the support from various, say, firms and corporations to presidential candidates historically is not different, and in fact, it's sometimes it overrides the Republican support when it comes to support of the Democratic Party by these large corporations that have quite a bit of power. So, so in that sense, there's this tug of war, and so a quick question, which sort of wraps up, hopefully, what we were talking about. Do you think, first of all, that do you see these two forces? This is a very broad description. Do you see these two forces, and do you think one will win over the other, or is it about the type of issues, and then on some issues, part or this side is likely to triumph, and then on other issues the other would?
Yeah. I mean, the unfortunate part is that it depends on what happens, of course, in the elections in Georgia in those two seats. That's absolutely crucial that we have an evenly split Senate with a tie breaking vote coming from the vice president. From the things that I've read, it's still, I think the Republicans are better positioned to win these two seats. So that's the first question. I think that will be the big determinant. But given the loss of all of the seats in the House and the difficulty of the Democrats winning a bare tie-breaking majority, best case scenario in the Senate, it's going to be almost impossible to push through a real agenda of progressive change. And I'd say, in terms of the question of the left, I think, the United States, of course, because of its fight against the so-called tyranny of the majority that many of us would call democracy, um, it makes the parties skew to the right. But when I say left in the context of the United States, what I mean is a kind of, it's not the left of the Communist Party. The United States is the biggest anti-communist hegemon in the world. And so that history of violent anti-communism has deeply shaped 20th and 21st century politics. So when I talk about the left in the United States, what I mean, even in the context of electoral politics, is the basis of social democracy. So fighting for core redistributive questions, strengthening the welfare state, considering Medicare for all, i.e., national health insurance, taking insurance out of the private realm, supporting a strengthening of public infrastructure, which in a lot of countries, I guess, they have a much broader set of portfolio of political options. But I think it's looking, I hate to be pessimistic, but it's looking very bleak to me. I don't see, given the real vulnerability of the Democratic Party in House and Senate elections, how this kind of effort would take place. I think that Trump has been very important in creating a model of governance in which Republicans are terrified to have Trump turn against them. Even though he's not going to be the president, it's very unlikely. I don't think his attempts at a coup, or what people have called his attempt at a coup, is going to work. But he's not going to disappear. He's going to continue to be a kingmaker. And this is why the Republicans, they're terrified of him. In order to get election, he has been enormously successful with his base. This election is really not a defeat of Trump. It's a relatively small margin in the Electoral College, in which he was still able to maintain the electoral base of 2016. And of course, we know, and this is a very important point that no one is talking about in the mainstream media, his total number of votes and percentages from white women actually increased, even in the context of the COVID pandemic. So Trump is going to remain a very powerful force. I think that one reason, and I'm still thinking through this. I'll just say I'm a historian, not a political scientist. So this is kind of my deep interest in politics versus my profession. So some of this is kind of me as citizen trying to understand our country. But one of the things I'm deeply frustrated about is how Democrats continue to reach across the aisle when it's clear this won't work. And my latest thoughts about that is it just really has to do with the donors in the Democratic Party. There is a real anxiety about the left in the Democratic Party. And the promise of bipartisanship is partially a signal, not only to Republicans, which I think there is very little chance of getting Republican members of the House or the Senate to work with Democrats. I mean, if you think that, you haven't been paying attention at all. So I think that that actually has a lot more to do with the fights between a corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which is so strong and powerful, the fact that we have not had any campaign finance reform. So the Democratic Party, what its traditional base had been, apart from the plebiscite essentially that you had in the South because of Jim Crow and white supremacy. In the North, the Democratic Party had been the party of liberalism, the party to attract urban immigrants, the party of the poor people in the United States. But now the Democratic Party has become so dominated by a kind of corporate vision that the basic fights over the most basic questions of social welfare have been expunged. So the combination of the lessons that people are drawing from the strength of the Republican Party in this moment, despite the catastrophic policy that Donald Trump has had on COVID, in which 250,000 people have died, and likely we're going to see another 200,000 die in the next 6 months, or even more than that. Despite that, the fact that he was able to actually increase his total number of votes, I think that the lessons that the leaders of the Democratic Party are taking from that is that centrism and trying to cultivate the tiny portion of the Republican Party that is not completely identified with Trump is their way forward. I wish I could be more cheery. I'd
You
like to
are
be.
you are perfect. This is really all very important, and I know that you are sort of being concise because there's a lot more to say, but this is how things work with these interviews and discussions, given that so many are happening, but each, I think, each is catering to a particular community, a particular audience. So we would love for our audience to get your view and insights. um, okay, this is like a little different. I've heard that your faculty grad union has engaged in electoral activism and established a freedom school. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it fits with the current moment?
Sure. Um, so I teach at Rutgers, and we have a very powerful union that is the Rutgers AAUP AFT. And it's a union, it's one of the few faculty unions in the country in which all the categories, with the exception of part time lecturers, are included within the same union. So you have tenure track faculty, tenured and tenure track faculty, you have non tenure track faculty, and then you have graduate students. And um, our union has been really engaged in thinking about the importance of broad redistributive labor politics. So, one of the reasons I wanted to link our discussion of our union with this larger discussion about the American elections is that I myself, I've largely been involved in anti-carceral politics and supporting and documented the movement for Black lives, fighting against mass incarceration. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I've gotten involved in our union because it's a true left-led union. And I think one of the ways to bring the Democratic Party back to its redistributive base and to thinking about how is it going to be a viable party in the future is really the importance of the labor movement and working class organizing. So, to this end, our union has developed a freedom school, which is modeled on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the idea is to do political education within our rank and file, which actually includes a coalition of 20,000 different unionized workers. So, I think the place in politics that I derive the most hope from are the labor victories that have happened under a Trump administration. So, of course, you remember the federal shutdown, which was absolutely catastrophic. I live in Philadelphia. I used to live in a part of Philadelphia that was right next to the federal building. And the kind of difficulty that this created for people with not getting paid for over a month, it was just catastrophic. And it was the organizing of Sarah Nelson, the flight attendants, and some of the other airline, the airline employees that really put pressure on the Senate and on Trump to stop the federal shutdown. So labor politics was actually crucial to that. And it was Sarah Nelson's call for a general strike and the implication that the whole flying industry was going to be shut down in the United States. That because, of course, air traffic controllers were not getting paid. And so it was putting this core infrastructure of the US at risk. And that political story has not been told in a widespread way. And I think that the victories of the teachers' unions, including in right to work states in the South, like West Virginia and Oklahoma, was incredible. So I think that one of the ways forward politically is through a revived labor movement centered especially in the public sector. I think that's really important. So I mentioned the activism I'm involved in with our union, which has also done its different kinds of political outreach and education, that I think that combined with the movement for Black Lives and the kind of mass protest that we've seen in the past year, as well as the Bernie campaign, both of 2016 and 2020, I think building these alternate sites of power are very crucial right now, because while electoral politics is important, I think that we will never see a Democratic Party or rules change without independent social movement organizing, including that of the labor movement and the movement for Black lives.
Thank you for this. It's really, really important. I mean, in the end, we can opine and analyze, but this is the sort of thing that actually changes matters, organizing and action and collective action. So I'm glad that we were able to touch on this. Um, I will before I ask you for your final, words. I will ask you, or I'd like to ask you about not strategy per se, but kind of the your opinion of what will make a difference in terms of how divided and polarized the this country is. Is it? I mean, I've been watching and listening and reading a ton of material on this issue. Is it swaying the quote unquote white male vote towards the social justice train that is needed, or is it just more active organizing on part of the progressive movement, which might, I mean, these things are not mutually exclusive, but there are audiences within the more progressive side or pole of the population that are not active, and they need to be activated, and that's what happens when progressive politics engages in activism. It brings these people, the quote unquote the base, to become more active, involved. But is it? Some people focus more on the need to address the concerns of quote unquote the plurality of the other side, because without that we're going to be continuously divided, almost 50-50, 45-55 on issues on which, and we're not talking about simple opinion matters. We're talking about basic rights of various sorts of populations. But on this particular matter, the matter of race, what is the way to go? And if it's a combination, what is the combination?
Yeah, I mean, it's important that I grew up in a place like Erie, Pennsylvania, and I saw the Erie, Pennsylvania post civil rights movement. I came from an interracial family who came from Missouri, who migrated north because it was illegal to have racial intermarriage. Those laws aren't overturned in Missouri until 1967. And we moved to a really, really conservative part of the country. And I'm not a big believer in trying to win the hearts and minds of Trump supporters. I think that we have to take people's political formations very seriously. And I think that in terms of how to shift American politics to address the real questions of people being able to afford health care, people being able to afford to educate their children. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things about the United States is that it's the things that are most essential, healthcare, education, elder care, and childcare, are completely unaffordable for the overwhelming majority of the population. And if we consider this a kind of basic social safety net that allows people to lead fully realized lives and not to suffer in all of the kinds of catastrophic ways that we're seeing in the COVID crisis. How do we get there? I think the way is by trying to organize the people that aren't voting. One of the biggest determinants for not voting is class. So there is enormous, I mean, in this election, everyone's so thrilled about the population turnout, the voter turnout, but it was what? Somewhere between 50 and 60%. In most presidential elections, it's barely 50 or below. And then when you go to down ballot races, it's even smaller. So I think that there is an enormous population in the United States that does not vote. And we demonize this population and talk about them. But I think one of the reasons people don't vote is because they don't feel that their true interests are being represented. Populations, policies like Medicare for All are incredibly popular among the electorate, but also among people that aren't voting. So to me, the way forward is, number one, letting go of this strategy that has defined the Democratic Party since at least 1984. And some of it can be traced back to the kind of mourning of the loss of white support for the Democratic Party after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Letting go this strategy where you focus on a tiny, narrow percentage of the white population. The white population does not vote for the Democratic Party and has not done so since the Civil Rights Movement. We all know this, but somehow it's the unwillingness to talk about it. It's the elephant in the room in every discussion of two-party politics. And so we need to actually take that lesson to heart and say, all right, racial politics are foundational. They go back to the origins of the United States and its very structure of government. So rather than focusing on trying to win over a tiny margin of the white population that has consistently voted Republican, then that means, what do? We focus on, number one, thinking about the future. And the future of the United States is a white minority with a very large Latinx population coming from different parts of the world, a growing multiracial population. The core base of the Democratic Party is, of course, African Americans and African American women in particular. And we still have a large portion of the Asian population that's voting Democratic. So the racial politics are absolutely crucial. And thinking that these people matter, I think that not just viewing them as a captured minority. If I am skeptical of the Edison polls that were being talked about, number one, because they only conduct questions in English, so they're biased towards English speakers. Two, they tend to focus on multiracial polling sites rather than majority Black and brown. So there's a lot of evidence that the Edison polls tend to skew towards Republicans for this reason. So I think that some of those questions are I want to see what the National Voter Survey has to say and more carefully digested election information. But that said, there's another way to interpret this relatively small shift towards the Republican Party and towards Trump, not because of the incredibly compelling vision of Trump, but by Juan Gonzalez and other activists have talked about the absence of Biden in really trying to win the votes of Latinos. Latinos were very important to supporting the Bernie campaign, both in 2016 and 2020. So I think one can also view it as the failure of the Democratic Party to deliver for the constituencies that are its most consistent supporters and its future. I mean, Joe Biden's statement, which people just talked about it as a kind of gaffe, but he said, essentially, you aren't Black if you're not supporting me in the Democratic Party. I mean, imagine that. Is that Not, can you imagine a better way to encapsulate the captive nature of the Black population inside the Democratic Party? Focusing on low income people of all different colors who don't vote, and then really speaking to the core constituencies. We haven't talked about foreign policy, in which I'm by no means an expert. But one of the things I'm very concerned about with the Biden presidency is that, certainly in foreign policy matters, Biden represents the right wing of the Democratic Party. And I think some of the things that Trump is doing right now, I actually don't think they're crazy. I think they're um, smart like a fox. That I think with Trump talking about this immediate troop withdrawal, and I think that I don't see that entirely as a bad thing. I would like to see the troops withdrawn from the Middle East. I would like our imperialist and violent foreign policy to be stopped. But one of the strategies behind this, I think, is that, as happened in 2016, the Democratic Party has become, in many ways, a party of war. It was so important to Hillary Clinton's identity. And one of the big concerns that I think that the political concerns behind what Trump is doing is that, one, he wants the policy victory of saying he was going to end the wars, and this can be pointed to because he wants to continue to have a political future. But it's going to put Biden in a position, and given the kinds of advisors that he's talking about appointing, that I'm very afraid that they will absolutely embrace this kind of bipartisan war footing, putting America, essentially restoring America as this unipolar power. And this is another Achilles heel of the Democratic Party right now. This is actually not popular. This is not, Trump was able to get a lot of support for voters by talking about it, yes, in isolationist, semi-racist, and economic nationalist terms, not in the ways that we would like. But I do think there is a genuine fatigue about the endless wars. And one of my biggest fears is that, in addition to all the problems I've talked about, the racial bias inside the Democratic Party, that they're going to embrace the politics of war. And if they do that, I think that that will truly be to their detriment, not just in the next 4 years, but in the near future.
Thank you, Donna. Let me just remind everybody that we are speaking, and we have come to the sort of end, but we're speaking with the Professor Donna Murch, who's Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University. I have included the bio, the very impressive bio, in the feed, and we will be publishing this officially with all of the information for people to learn more about your work. Is there anything that you would like to leave us with in terms of what to look forward in the potentially immediate future, much more so than the long run? We've talked a bit about the medium run and so on. Is there anything, any last words, whether on this or any other issue that, and it's okay for them not to be glowing?
Okay, I'll try to say something hopeful, which I genuinely think is that I'm very excited by young people. Not just because middle-aged people are always excited by young people. That's the definition of middle age, is that you take ever greater joy in younger people than you did when you were their age. But I really do think the country is changing. It's changing racially. It's also changing ideologically. Evangelical Christians are going to have a hard time reproducing themselves in the same way. There is a strong age component among evangelical Christians who are the true far right of this country. So, younger voters are deeply mobilized by things that particular constituencies of the so-called left dismiss as identity politics. But these matter a great deal to young people because they see these rightly as fights over equal opportunity. So the depth of homophobia, the kind of gender violence and language that the current Republican Party represents. I think younger people are growing up with different ideas. Gender to them is something that's profoundly socially constructed and not inevitable. They don't understand homophobia. They've grown up in an entirely different world. And so I actually have not so much hope for the near term, but for the far term in the transformation of the United States, not only the shrinking size of the white population, but also kind of the ideological shift. Because one of the biggest things is like, and this is how life works, which is through dialectics. Younger people are aware of how the essentials that I've talked about, how little those are available to them. They are aware of debt as well as climate destruction. And so they have their politics have shifted. They don't think they're going to make more money than their parents or as much money as their parents. And as a result, they are deeply socially minded. And this isn't just a kind of abstract ideology, it grows out of the circumstances of their lives. So I think in the longer term, the real possibilities for the United States. But just to circle back to the very important question that you asked at the beginning, in order for them to be fully represented along with the non white majority that is going to emerge in the United States, we need a rules change to our democracy, if we could call it a democracy. We need a rules change to our very narrow 18th century vision of what a democratic country is. And without that rules change, we are going to continue to shore up minority rule, both at our own peril and at the world's peril.
Wow. Okay. So this is wonderful. Thank you so much for your uh, insights and generosity and being with us for actually much longer than we had discussed. So I really appreciate it, and we all do. We are, for the first time, just so you know, we're actually on four platforms right now. This is why the audience is sort of divided in different places. But this way, people can access this discussion live, not just on Facebook, but also on YouTube. It's on YouTube, two YouTube channels and two Facebook channels. So I hope that people have been able to grab or to catch some of this, to grab, yeah, I know, maybe because we're talking about Trump, to catch some of this, and also we will be publishing it. So I'll send you, and we will publish the link to the entire interview with some more information in the body. Thank you again so much. I was with Professor Donna Murch, who is a professor of history at Rutgers University, actually where my partner also teaches now, and this is very exciting. So I hope to be seeing you as well, and hope we can talk more down the line. I will save this interview, and I'll actually pull some nuggets from it, and I will bring them up. Hopefully, maybe in a, I don't know, few months, a year, so we can talk about it further. So thank you very much, Donna, and thank you for joining us. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you so much, Bassam. I'm honored.
Take care.